My name is Richard Gray. I'm a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Saskatchewan. Today I talked about understanding export basis. Export basis is the difference between Vancouver FOB prices and farm prices in Saskatchewan. As we can see from the last 2 years, whenever there's more grain that can be delivered than there is capacity, export basis gets larger, and typically the world price doesn't change, but the farm price drops as the basis gets larger. So it's critical to understand the differences between the farm price, which is the cash bids of elevators, and the FOB price in Vancouver. If we go over the last 2 years, we can actually see the impacts, or 3 years, I guess we'll start 3 years ago. The first year operating without the single desk, we saw about a $70 per ton difference between the FOB prices in Vancouver and the farm price. That meant they are a $70 export basis. And in that year, that was the 2012 crop, it was somewhat smaller than expected. There was lots of capacity to move grain, and grain elevator companies had to bid aggressively in order to get the farmers' grain. In 2013, we had a very large crop. In fact, it was a record crop by far, and that meant there wasn't the capacity in the grain handling and transportation system to move the whole crop. So farmers wanted to deliver more grain than there was capacity in the system, and the grain elevator companies, in order to ration the capacity they had available, just kept lowering their cash bids until the phone stopped ringing, or just rang once, as I said. So this means whenever there's an imbalance between the available supply and the capacity to move it, you basically get a larger export basis that depresses the farm price in Saskatchewan. We saw very high basis levels during the 2013 crop year, and they've continued somewhat into this last crop year, largely because we brought a bunch of stocks into the 2014 year, which added to the supplies that were available. So farmers had some of the 2013 crop plus the 2014 production they wanted to sell, which was a lot of supply. If we try to measure what price impact that was, I did 3 different calculations. The easiest or the most conservative calculation I made suggests that 80% of the grain deliveries that farmers made were affected by the higher basis levels, and that all farmers actually basically priced their basis 3 months in advance. If you make those 2 assumptions, it works out to about $50 a ton the producer's price reserve was reduced during that 2-year period. So if a producer sold 1,000 tons, that would be 50 times 1,000 or $50,000. A lot of producers delivered a lot more grain than that. So it was a substantial cost. I estimate the cost to the Western Canadian producers somewhere around $5 billion, give or take. Okay. Going forward, this current crop year, we're getting back to near normal basis levels. We basically had 2 years of excellent grain movement, and as a result of that grain movement, the ending stocks are back to normal levels. Some farmers are even reluctant to sell what they do have in stocks because they're wondering about how big the crop is going to be this year with the lack of rainfall we've had. How the basis actually ends up will depend on how big the crop is. If the crop is bigger than what's expected, maybe the system won't have the capacity to move it. In that case, the basis levels go back up. Farm prices could be reduced again. Or if the crop is smaller than expected, we'd see more or less that return to normal basis levels of about $70 a ton. So we don't know yet. We don't know how big this crop is yet. There's a few weeks yet to go, so we'll know better in September where that's going to be. It's really important, even if the basis levels do improve this year and we get back to more normal basis levels, there's been an upward trend in production over time in Saskatchewan. So given there's been an upward trend, it suggests that we're going to have a lot more grain to move in the future than we have in the past. So these issues over a lack of transportation capacity are likely to come back in the future, particularly for West Coast access, because most of our markets are in Asia and the growing markets. So it's really important to have the West Coast capacity that's large enough to move the crops in a fairly timely ways. And we've got to figure out ways to do that. How do we increase capacity in the grain handling and transportation system? Some people have suggested we just deregulate the system and the railways will move more grain. Well, if you look on the U.S. side of the border, that hasn't happened. They've had much higher freight rates. In fact, during the last fall, the freight rates got extremely high in the U.S., and yet their system didn't perform much better than our system. So there's a very loose linkage between freight rates and the amount of grain that's going to be moved. So deregulation is not the answer. And the bottom line is the railways are largely have market power because they're the single way to move grain, and that monopoly power means that you can't rely on the market forces or their ability to price to bring about a market solution. So what do we need to do? Well, I would argue that under the maximum revenue entitlement, that's the regulation that the railways have for their rate structure, there's a need to provide extra incentives to move more grain during the winter periods. It's more expensive for railways to move grain during the winter, so they need to actually get paid more to move grain during the difficult time in winter, just to keep those export terminals running at full capacity. January, February, March, it would really help a lot if we could keep the rail moving up during that period of time. And then finally, I guess, if we're looking forward, it's really important we have more coordination in the system. Whenever there's surprises or there's a lack of exchange within the supply chain, you end up with moving less grain than you otherwise could. So I think we need to think about a West Coast futures market, cash market exchange would be very useful. I think we need to think about a third-party logistics coordinator that may actually become active whenever the system gets backed up. We will have snow slides, we will have cold weather, and as soon as railways get backordered, you don't want them deciding what cars move when, because that won't line up with which boats arriving, etc. So it's really important to have a third party to be able to sort out some of those issues, and the industry needs to think about how they're going to create that neutral third party. And finally, we need better information. Efficient markets require good information in order to function. They learned this in the U.S. There's extensive price reporting and volume reporting, far more than we have in Canada. And we need to do a far better job here, both in estimating the size of our crop, reporting prices, and reporting movement levels. The more information we have, the better the system's going to be coordinated out, and the better it's going to run.